Hey everyone, my name is Avery Harding, and I'm on the content and marketing team here at Mozilla Foundation. And today I have a great chat for you all today. We're talking about AI's impact on social justice. We're featuring and centering the AI intersections database led by our very own Kendria Rankin. She's the research editor for Insights at Mozilla Foundation. We're also here with Meyer Goblin Haig, the executive director of the Disability Culture Lab. And we're here to talk today about just AI and the various intersections that AI finds itself at. I think AI is really just flourishing in a way where I don't know if I ever asked for it to flourish in this way, and people and like consumers want it to flourish in this way, but here it is, and it's affecting any issue you can think of. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Kendria, Meyer, how are you both doing today?
Not too bad. Happy to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, yeah. How are you doing, Meyer?
So excited to join you and to talk about this really important topic.
Yeah, no, I'm excited to talk about it too. So maybe we can start with first things first. So Kendra, how can you walk us through like the story of how the database came to be?
Sure. So, as you mentioned, it's called the AI Intersections Database, and it launched on April 18th of this year. And it grew out of research that actually started even before I joined Mozilla Foundation 3 years ago. I don't know. But the point of the research is that it explores AI impacts and the people who are poised to address them. And an early version of that research ended up with like an internal cataloging of the data that we unearthed. So, like all these AI impacts and places specifically where the impacts of AI intersect with social justice issues. So, where does AI intersect with racial justice? Where does it intersect with disability justice? And then the people who are either already working on those issues specifically as they relate to AI or who are poised to be partnered with in order to do that. And so, like I said, we had this early version that really pulled that information together, but the goal was always to create an external tool that could serve as a movement resource and also model good alternative data governance, which is something that we talk about a lot here in Mozilla.
Yeah.
But to do that, we had to create a new version of the database. And so that's where I came in. And the whole point of it really was to make sure that we are walking the walk that or walking the talk that we do here at Mozilla. So it has a built-in mechanism for folks to provide permission to have their data included, which, and I think we're going to talk a little bit about opt-in and opt-out later. And it was really important to us that this be something that folks can opt into so that they maintain control over their own data. Um, you don't really have to spend too much time on Twitter, which I'm never calling X, before you see like how things like Meta wanted folks to opt out of them using our data on Facebook and Instagram to change its AI system. But then in some countries, you don't even have the option to do that. And that's the opposite of what we do and the opposite of what we advocate for. And the database is a good example of that, in that folks have to, opt in and verify that they actually want their data to be used in that way. And folks can also leave at any time. You can even preemptively opt out so that if anyone suggests you or submits you to the database, if you've preemptively opted out, you won't be included. And so that was what we were looking to do. And the database currently tracks seven justice areas. We name them as community health and collective security, economic justice, environmental justice, disability justice, gender justice, human rights, and racial justice. That's all of
Wow.
them in alphabetical order.
So many
And
top. Oh, first of all, yeah, shout out to you for getting that in alphabetical order. But so many topics, and it's like such a broad scope of the things you all are covering there. First of all, I agree with you. I'm not going to call Twitter X because it sounds like a porn site. It's been
never,
Twitter for
not
like most of my
happening.
life. Just gonna use
He's
Twitter. Um,
obsessed with X,
it's just weird. It's just weird. It just feels like, have you seen this on X? It sounds like an HR complaint.
right.
But so we both, you're my coworker. Like you're literally, we both work at Mozilla. How are folks outside of Mozilla perceiving and receiving the intersections database? What have you heard
Yeah.
so far?
So far, a lot of people being really glad that this exists. There are some folks who do pieces and parts of it, and that is fantastic. And our goal was just to make this really easy to use, and beyond that, to make it something that other folks can use as a model to do their own work. But
Hmm.
so yeah, we've just gotten a lot of really great feedback of people being glad that this exists and telling us how they're using it. We've heard from folks using it for researching folks to reach out to for grants to support their research. We've heard of folks using it to find folks to be on. So we do MozFest is one of our convenings that we do here at Mozilla. I know that even internally, our wranglers used it in order to find people to be a part of MozFest Amsterdam last week, or 2 weeks ago now. Time is flying. But so we're already seeing people using it to collaborate, which is really what we envisioned it for. We think of this as infrastructure for movement, and we hope that folks will use it to educate themselves and to connect with other people and organizations around these spaces where social justice issues intersect with AI impacts.
I love that. And not to make this entire first part a giant advertisement for Mozilla, we already got a MozFest mentioned. We got so that's good. Check out the MozFest
Good
panels.
now.
We also, this might be one of the first times on video that we see the new Mozilla brand logo. So just want to call that out.
Oh, look
But
at
let us
that.
talk about AI and disability, and I'll kick it to Meyer because I want to talk about just how does AI intersect with disability justice?
Yes. I think this is so important. And I feel like one thing we have talked a lot about, Kenria and I, because we also get to work together at a lot of intersections, the two of us, um, is that, there's winners and there's losers as AI is coming out, and we're already seeing that. And one thing that I hear a lot in the disability community right now is like, why does this matter? In my community right now, we've got police violence that's disabling people. We've got a massive wave of, militarized police violence right now across the country. That's disabling. We've got folks who are struggling, to access food, to access benefits. We've got the minimum wage. We've got all of these like really serious issues in the disability community. So why AI? And the reality though is that like AI is already here. And I think people see AI as this thing that's like not a thing yet. But really, like I've got a family member who's already been laid off because of AI, who had to train the AI to replace their job already. And that happened just a few months ago. And at an organization that I work with at New Disabled South, they're starting a program right now where they're talking to warehouse workers who are already being surveilled by AI in their workplaces. And these big corporations are using AI to surveil, really working class workers. And when you talk about AI, and surveillance, of workers, like which workers show up in the exact same way every day and which workers don't. Like disabled workers' bodies don't necessarily conform. And when you talk about ADA accommodations, is AI listening? Probably not. And, just last month, the ACLU launched a big lawsuit against this AI why am I forgetting? HR staffing firm that said, oh, we're going to reduce bias by using AI. We got this, and lo and behold, what happened? Folks of color and disabled folks found their applications weren't going through, and white able-bodied workers were getting
Mm,
hired at higher rates with this AI staffing firm. And it turned out that AI was not reducing bias because the people who were programming AI were the same people who were biased in the first place. And
mhm.
so, there are these, it's really interesting because I think a lot of folks feel like, oh, AI is this big future problem, when actually all the problems that we're talking about right now are already being supercharged right now. And so, like always, when you're disabled, being rich is a great way to be disabled. And I think a lot of the really exciting technologies with AI are already becoming really incredible for folks who are very wealthy and disabled. But for folks who are most marginalized in the disability community, disabled folks of color, poor disabled folks, they're already seeing the really scary parts of AI. So it's a
Yeah,
very interesting moment.
yeah, and I'd love to dig into that part more. Of if you're rich and disabled, what does being disabled in 2024 look like for you in this AI future, which is not the future, it's the present, versus if you don't have those luxuries, what does that look like? Are there examples that come to mind?
Yeah, I mean, well, there's all this really exciting stuff right now with AI. If you're rich and disabled, or if you're you're just very interested in this cutting edge and you've got access to all this technology, you've got text to voice. So for some folks that haven't had access to who don't have a voice, who haven't had access to great technology in the past, it used to be that the voice that you had access to was very robotic. Now, some
Hmm.
people are actually exploring recreating folks who have lost their voices you can now recreate a voice using AI from prior voicemails and things. And you can actually then do a text to voice of your old voice. Now, some folks say, oh, that's incredible. And this is what I've always wanted. And some folks are like, ooh, I don't know if I want to go back. That's a
Yeah.
little creepy.
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
not
That's valid.
and Alice Wong has written a bit about this on Twitter, and like a really interesting exploration, which I recommend everyone go and check out. And so that's very interesting. You also have AI captions, and some of this is something, if you're rich, and also if you're sort of in the middle, right? Paying for somebody to caption for you in everyday life. It's one thing at big events, which I'm going to note, not every event is paying for like in-depth captioning of a live person. But what we've seen using AI is all of a sudden this huge proliferation of captions everywhere because of AI. I'm using captions right now for this event that are provided by AI. Thank you, Zoom. And that's something that didn't exist a few years ago. And we've got folks who are carrying that around in their pockets everywhere they go that aren't provided by a live captioner. Now, if you've got enough money, you might be able to have a live captioner and that would be a better quality. But with AI, you can also have a language justice element of that where AI can caption and then translate into dozens of languages live. Now that's still money. It's a
Yeah.
lot of money.
Right.
But in the middle, if you were really wealthy, you could have somebody live doing a much better job. Or if you're an organization, you might be able to pay for that. But somewhere in the middle and also like wealthier than the average, you've got AI kind of filling in some of those gaps. You also have a lot of captioners who are much better at it.
Yeah.
And what about those jobs?
Right. How do we even the playing field to make it so that the folks who are rich and disabled, so to make it so that the folks who are not rich and disabled kind of have equal access to some of those things that rich disabled people get access to? And both can answer. I don't want, sorry if, yeah, anyone can answer that.
How do we level the playing field? I think a lot of it comes down to access and transparency. I love that Meyer, just mentioned some of the ways that this could potentially help people. But I think that we also need to think about the ways that it's potentially hurting people. And so part of the way that we level the playing field is by advocating for the alleviation of those issues, right? So, we have services that on their face could be really great. Like there are AI services that let you do things like enter your symptoms and then it'll spit out a differential diagnosis that you can then theoretically take to your healthcare provider. But the underlying question is the question that, comes up every time we talk about AI, and that especially matters when we're talking about folks who are already vulnerable in the systems, which is what happens to my data? Are
Hmm.
my personal details going to be safe? Are they going to use it to train the model? Could one day my employer be able to access my health data because I use this AI system? There's
Yes.
not things in place to prevent those things. And yes, the answer is yes, that could happen. And there's that right now. We don't have any guardrails in place to keep those things from happening. So a lot of what leveling the playing field looks like is creating policy that actually protects all of us. And then part of that also is just these systems tend to be opaque. There's this complete lack of transparency. That's why we call them black boxes, because we can't see inside them. There are systems that are already AI systems that have been used to triage patients for the last few years. Another example of how AI is now, not just the future. And a study found that some of those systems are using things like money spent on healthcare as a proxy for urgency. So if you are someone who is not wealthy, who is trying their best, but only have so much money to be able to pay for your health care, because, Maya and I can both tell you as disabled people that being disabled is extraordinarily expensive. And if you are somebody who doesn't have that money, and they're using how much money you've spent as a proxy for the urgency of how much care you need and how quickly you need it, what they found was that it led to Black people who have less money to spend on their health receiving less care and lower quality care than white people who were actually healthier but had more money to spend. And it just
Mm.
brings us, it's brings us back to these patterns that have existed, quite frankly, forever. AI, while it is a newish technology, it has traditional ways. It just asserts and entrenches these disparities that have long been in the system, whether we're talking about economic injustice, we're talking about racial injustice, we're talking about, folks, ableism. All of those things are just re-entrenched by AI at this current moment. So we level the playing field by advocating in order to make that not be the case.
Yeah, and it's unfortunate because you think with the amount of energy and effort we're putting into creating AI, clearly there is the genius and ingenuity there to, do such a Herculean task. But why don't we put that energy towards getting out of the same ruts and the same patterns that we've been in
Mm.
to kind of level the playing field
Absolutely.
for everybody? Maya, I
Yep.
don't know if you wanted to add to that before we go to the next question, when it comes to like how do we even things out?
Yeah, I mean, I would love to. I feel like the big problem right now, as I see it, is that AI is completely dominated by investors.
Mm.
And those investors are largely like wealthy, white, cisgendered, able-bodied men. And the result is that the inputs into AI are by those same folks. And so, what we need, honestly, is just like a massive organizing effort to counter that power. Because what we have right now is just like a massive shift in power. We're having like this massive revitalized moment in the labor movement, in particular in workers' rights. But at the same time, investors are just seizing this massive amount of power. And really, none of us have showed up on AI yet. I mean, there just isn't. I keep asking people, okay, so where's the coalition? Like, who's organizing? Can I just plug in? And there is nowhere to plug in because it isn't there yet. And we have to just build it. And that's one thing that I'm hoping to hoping to do, and I've been trying to work on, because I'm like, okay, then I guess we have to put it together, because the reality is, we've got these really big issues, which is if they're the ones who are putting this together, Kenria's talking about where's your data go, and we're already seeing that with, for instance, period apps. Abortion's
Mm-hmm.
criminalized across the entire, like, half the country at this point, right? What if you put in your symptoms and you're pregnant? What's law
Right.
enforcement do with that information? And if you're disabled and pregnant, it is incredibly difficult to move and access those services. It can be wildly dangerous to put your symptoms in, depending on what kind of symptoms those are, because we already know law enforcement uses Google searches. They're going to use AI searches in the same exact way. This is dangerous stuff that we're talking about. And we also know that doctors are just as dangerous as cops to a lot of disabled folks of color. Disabled folks of color, that's half of police deaths. Black disabled folks. That's like a large part of police incarcerations. And so, when we're talking about doctors, that's dangerous. And then who's programming AI? So if you're plugging your symptoms in, I think a lot of people are going to AI because they're like, what if I could get a bias-free take on my symptoms? But if it's the same people putting that information into AI, are we actually getting bias-free results on our symptoms? No. Okay, well then
No.
we need to organize to make sure we're getting inclusive inputs, that, Black doctors and disabled doctors, et cetera, are the ones plugging in. Because just like Kenria, I was plugging my symptoms in really early to AI because I was like, could I finally get bias-free info for a lot of this stuff that I haven't solved in a long time? But the truth was, what I really needed was a disabled doctor, and that's who finally gave me a lot of
Mm.
answers to my problem. After one of my, I'm multiply disabled, but like, after like 13 years of being undiagnosed with a rare disease, I've got a friend who works in AI, and they really believe that AI is going to solve the rare disease problem. But what I needed was a disabled doctor. And like, I think what AI is going to need is the same thing, right? It's going to be inclusive inputs. And so I think on surveillance, we need inclusive inputs. I think on, not hypercharging oppression, we're going to need inclusive inputs. And I think on not ending up with mass layoffs and like maybe having this beautiful world we dream of, like a 32-hour work week and time for art and music and like a beautiful world where AI actually helps us, we're going to need to organize real
Yeah.
hard and real fast.
There's so many threads I want to pull on there. I think someone, I did not say this first, but
Sorry, I went too hard there.
what's that?
Sorry, I went too hard or too long there.
No, 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 no. Definitely. There's no such thing as, I just got a message in my Slack that just said Meyer's great. So like everything you're saying right now is like fantastic. There's so many threads I want
Yes.
to pull on there. First of all, the whole idea of like there's gonna be more time for art and music, like they've been saying that since like the washing machine and the dishwasher. Like it feels like life is busier than ever, no matter how far like ahead advanced we get in life. And I'm not the first person to say that. I can't claim, but like it just feels that way. It feels like we're busier than ever. So I don't know if AI is going to be the thing that gives us all back our time. Yeah, that's what I really want to pull on there. There's so many great things you said, but I want to make space for something you just said. Doctors are just as dangerous as cops for disabled folks of color. I want to sit with that for a bit, because that's the first time I've heard that, and I want to
Mm.
like make room to talk about that if we want to talk about that more.
Oh man. Yeah. So, as I said earlier, I am also a disabled person. And even if you think about before the times of AI, and as Maya mentioned, we do know that these apps, our own part of our organization, P&I, has done a lot of research around how these apps share our information, but the doctors are the first apps. And when something that seems as simple and innocuous as a doctor asking you what's the question they always ask, the date of the first day of your last menstrual period. They always ask that question, and I stopped answering it a few years ago, because one, it's none of their business, but also two, because that information can then be used in order to figure out more information about my reproductive health. And because this country does not believe that abortion is reproductive health, that is information that I keep to myself to keep from being criminalized as a Black woman who is already viewed as less than human, as having being immune to pain, all of these things that persist, these stereotypes that persist about Black people. And then you add on the fact that I am multiply disabled on top of that and go into these spaces. And essentially, as Meyer said, like these healthcare workers often have more of an allegiance to the law enforcement system than they do to the people who they are supposed to actually be taking care of. And so, unfortunately, it is key for us to keep our information to ourselves. And when you introduce something like AI, that becomes a lot harder to do.
That's very true. Yeah, I feel like we were talking about AI, and I think about just the question of who is this for. It feels like big tech will always have reasons to get consumers to use something, but there's two reasons you do something, a good reason and the real reason. And it just, I can't help but feel like the real reason is to just fire all the workers and just have robots do all these jobs and not have to pay robots as much as we pay humans. But I think Meyer
Mhm.
said something before that made me think of the idea of just like, okay, you have AI, you type in your symptoms, and then what you realize is, oh, I actually need a human doctor or disabled doctor. What if at the end of this AI road, we realize that all we needed all along were humans? Like, is that a crazy outcome? I feel like that's gonna be the outcome.
I mean,
Maya, do
not
you want
no. I don't think that's wild. I mean, I thought something on Twitter the other day that was like, I actually only want to listen to music made by humans and like read things that humans created. I'm not like, why would I want to listen to something that somebody didn't like want to create, that they didn't like, that somebody didn't want to write, that they didn't like put their heart into? Like, why would I want to spend my time on that? And like, who wants to be supervised or interviewed by a robot? Like, that sounds awful. But I think that the reason, I mean, I think that if you talk about who wins, like there's a reason why the investor class wants this, and it's that it's money.
right?
Like
Yeah,
no one else wants this. The only reason for it is money, really. And I think that we can sit around and think about, oh, there's all these ways that maybe this could make my life a little bit better. But the reality is that most of those little ways that you can imagine are minuscule compared to the ways in which it's actually being created for. Those are just crumbs that they're giving us in exchange for the money, the mass amount of money that they're hoping to extract from us in order to get what they want. And
right.
and that I think that's what we're looking at, and that's why we need to have this massive organizing effort. Because we're looking at the impacts on our lives, the massive climate impacts, the massive um, supercharged depression efforts when they put into the algorithm their existing biases and then expand them into these systems that they can then put into these like huge scales. And you're like, no, I didn't want that. But I think money will push it unless we organize really hard. And that's
Right.
why I think, we have to just go so hard to tell these stories and so fast.
Yeah.
We're so behind, I think, already at this moment.
I saw an interesting comment roll in that said it would be interesting to know the percentage of disabled developers slash people with disabled people working in the tech industry working with AI. It'd be interesting to know the percentage of those
Yes.
developers. Do we have numbers on those? I've never seen numbers like that.
I saw some really interesting numbers last week. I was in a really interesting conversation with folks working on AI on the number of like folks of color and women on the boards. And it's like almost, I think it might be zero on folks of color on the boards of the big AI firms, or it's almost zero. And there's like one woman on,
Wow,
it's really low.
that's kind of bleak. Um, One question I had is like, what do able-bodied people tend to overlook when it comes to disability justice and AI? Like, what are some things that, yeah, able-bodied people tend to overlook?
Oh, that's a long list. I think the number one thing that able-bodied people tend to overlook is their own ableism.
Hmm.
Just as folks don't necessarily see the bias in the system, they don't see the bias in themselves. And just as that is what fuels these AI systems without us really realizing, or without a lot of folks really realizing, that there's bias built in that keeps you from, getting approved for a loan, or that makes it so that your community is being surveilled using facial recognition, whereas a community that, is wealthier and contains more white people is not, undergoing those things. All of those things are due to the bias that is inherent in the people who train these systems. And so when we are walking around with our own ableism informing the things that we do, the words that we use, the ways that we interact with people, the ways we interact with our coworkers, whether or not we think people are worthy, whether or not we think people are smart and able to do things, all comes down to our ableism. That even disabled people can have it, but I would name that as the number one thing that folks miss. About you,
Got it.
Maya?
Got it. Yeah.
I think another piece is like not getting lost in inspirational stories.
Mm.
Um, and I think about this a lot. I watched this article, read this article on this new wheelchair that climbs stairs.
Wow.
And and it was like, oh wow. And there are all these able-bodied people who are sharing this story because it was like, wow, a wheelchair that can climb stairs. It solves all of our problems, right? How incredible. Except for it's like this was like a $5 million wheelchair, right? And
Wow.
and when
Yeah.
you think about how many disabled people exist, it might have even been more than that. It's obscene, right? You know what would solve this problem for most disabled people, like much more efficiently, is if every building had a ramp.
Hmm.
And it's
Hmm.
like, I think that like not getting lost in the inspiration of some of AI's technology and thinking about the simplest solution, I think is really important. That like, okay, there might be inspirational ways to do things where you're like, oh, finally, like disabled people can overcome my ableism with this technology. Or, or we could offer another alternative for you, which is what if we challenged the built environments that made it so hard for disabled people to exist already?
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Systemic problems call for systemic solutions, and we can't tech our way or tech solutionism our way out of those things.
It's such a good point. Yeah, I'm reading a book right now called Invisible Women about just how if you're not designing something for anyone, really, you're designing it for like white guys. Like if it's like, oh, just
Yeah.
designing it,
It's
because
for
like no,
everybody.
yeah, oh, it's for everybody. It's like, oh, you design the sidewalk for everybody. Like if you're designing it for like no one in particular, you unfortunately you end up design like if you design a seatbelt for whoever you think of as the average person, you're going to design it for like the average bodied male person, not like pregnant women, for example. And I feel like the same probably goes for disability justice. Like
Yep.
if you're designing this building with only stairs and like to have to create a $5 million wheelchair to climb those stairs, maybe we add a ramp, maybe we add an elevator. Like that seems kind of almost basic when you look at it in hindsight.
Basic is
Yes.
exactly right.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
And like, and as AI is happening, I'm not sure we're stopping it, right? Like we should design it with inclusive inputs in mind. And I don't think that these companies are going to self-regulate themselves. So I think that we have to look at we have to look at government regulation. We have to force them to have these kinds of inclusive inputs. I think we have to create alternatives, like Mozilla is an alternative to like these corporate um, conglomerates already. Like we need smaller community alternatives that are created by communities for communities. We need disabled AI, structures created by and for disabled folks. We need, Black specific AI, small
Right.
input community infrastructure with like small communities in mind. We need indigenous AI, like small community AI structures with small community inputs for the by and for those communities. And like for community needs specifically, designed for those community needs. And we also need to like think about how we regulate these folks. And I think government's going to need to step up really freaking fast
I think you're
before
right.
they
I
come
think
for
you're
all of
right. So we actually have another panelist joining this conversation today. We have Chris Adams here. Chris Adams is the director of the Green Web Foundation and an organizer with climateaction.tech. And I'm glad that Chris, you're able to join today because there's a lot of if it's the AI intersections database, and there's a lot of intersections which AI sits at, and one of those intersections is environment, which and climate justice, which is an important uh, aspect. But we've been talking this entire time about disability justice, and there's an interesting overlap and intersection when it comes to climate and disability. Maybe you can start by talking about that.
Yeah, one of the big ones. Hi, folks. Yes, good afternoon, actually, from Berlin today. One of the key things is if you think about who are the people who are likely to be exposed to lots of the kind of perils and harms associated with, say, climate and climate change, it's often people who are disproportionately already marginalized. So you'll often be looking at like women or people who have disabilities or people who are in areas where they've been exposed to a number of the kind of environmental justice kinds of issues that we've seen elsewhere. People like fence line communities and stuff like this. This is something that you see coming up again and again. And it also, when you think about what we see AI actually being used for, in many cases, you may see you can see that there are we basically don't we have lots and lots of nice stories about AI being very, very useful for in some kind of like liberatory kind of in a liberatory capacity, right? But we actually don't have that much in the way of information about how it's actually being used at scale right now. We don't know, for example, amongst the largest providers of AI, is most of this being is this being used to extract more oil and gas, for example, or to do more, or to bring about, or do these things which we know end up causing these kinds of much larger and systemic harms across large communities like this. This is one thing that comes up again and again, and we have seen, for example, if I'm going to name some companies, for example, we've seen people inside Microsoft, for example, one of the largest and real leaders in AI. You've seen some very, very high profile people basically step down and say, yes, I know there are all these good uses, but there are also these other climate unfriendly uses which bring about all these harms visiting them on people, and I'm stepping down from this company because I've been spent the last 5 years working internally without actually having much success here, and I'm sick of banging my head against the wall. You do have this, but we don't have this kind of oversight or even this discussion right now. And I think it's something that's very, very overdue, especially when you think about who's actually harmed as a result of us essentially not really thinking about or not really paying attention to how it's actually being used at scale rather than these nice sounding, but in many cases, not that widespread uses, for example.
Yeah, it's such a good point. And I want to kind of re-emphasize this point of just maybe I ask, like, how do the effects of climate change compound on the people who are at least able to withstand the effects of climate change? I want to talk about that.
Yeah. I mean, so I can add a little bit there.
Yeah, please. Yeah, please.
I mean, this last week, there have been record temperatures recorded around the world. I know here in Washington, D.C., I mean, we are like in the hottest zone of the United States in terms of what our temperatures have been. And, you know, that provides a really great example of how climate change can be really dangerous for people like me. Like, I'm blessed to have central air conditioning at that. I did not grow up with anything like that. A come up for me. But I also have a condition that makes it nearly impossible for me to regulate my own body temperature the way that most people can. And I'm not the only one. And, without what some people see as a modern convenience, I quite frankly would not have survived this last week of temperatures. Now, think about all the disabled people around the world who don't have that privilege. Folks who don't have electricity, folks who don't have any kind of air conditioning. What the AI supply chain does is, well, part of what the AI supply chain does is, it takes massive amounts of energy in order to run these AI systems. They're doing mining in countries where they are trying to, mine the minerals that are then used to make the chips that are then running the AI, which has been creating these climate emergencies in these communities that, as Chris mentioned, already house quite vulnerable people, not even, yes, disabled people, but also folks who are, socioeconomically disadvantaged, people who, don't necessarily have access to great health care. And then we are further disabling them when we make their locales too hot for them to be able to survive. Like, that's just one example of a direct correlation between the way that what these systems do and the ways that they use energy and the ways that they impact people on the ground.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and just so deflating in certain ways. Maya, you want to add to that? I saw you kind of
Yeah.
perk up a little bit. Yeah.
I think I'm just 100% on exactly what Kenria said. Disabled people are hit first and worst by the effects of climate change and by the effects of fossil fuels. And just to note that climate change and the fossil fuel industry historically has been wildly disabling, and data centers themselves are being put primarily in low-income communities, and they're just a massive suck on electricity. And so, we're just going to see these data centers hypercharging climate change, which then are going to further disable more people. And then those disabled folks are then going to be more vulnerable to all these other things that we're talking about when it comes to all of these sort of corporate overreaches when it comes to AI and the hypercharging of oppression on AI. And it just all ends up kind of being one big web. I mean, it's all we all live multi-issue lives. And so it all just, sort of sits on top of each other.
That's such a good point. We all live multi-issue lives. You're right. Like, it's not just a matter of like, I'm black and that's where it stops. And that's like, it's like you can be black and disabled. You can be this and that. And there's just so many like overlapping things. And I think once again, to use the word compound, it compounds. Like, it's like, I want to see it like compound in a good way one day, Like it sometimes doesn't feel like that's ever happening. Like, anyway, another thing I want to talk about on the same tip is like
as in community and culture, but maybe not on the oppression side of things.
Yeah, and the good ways like compound interest can like work in your favor in like savings account, but like if you have debt, it doesn't. Like, I want to see the savings account version of like compounding good social justice stuff. We should also
the
talk about
reparations version.
Oh yeah, I'd love to see that part. That's for sure. I'd love to see that part. That is 100% for sure. Let's talk about how the infrastructure of AI, because it's not just like I type into a chat GPT, a text box, and then get like there's a background behind the curtain, behind the scenes happening where servers get spun up and energy gets used. Can we talk about the existence of the infrastructure that AI requires to run, the infrastructure being in underdeveloped nations? That feels like an important aspect too. I don't know who wants to touch on that. Maybe Chris?
Yeah, I can touch on some of this. So one of the examples that we probably is relatively high profile recently. If you've been to if you might have remembered, we had some of these Amazon stores where you were free to walk in, pick up some
Amazon Go
items, and what Amazon Go, right? And basically, this looked really, really cool. And at the time, it was sold and presented like, this is a fantastic kind of magical AI system using this stuff. Now, the thing that we ended up finding out was actually, rather than being AI in terms of artificial intelligence, this ended up being literally just hundreds and hundreds of people who were manually watching videos in India, and in a way to kind of generate some of the training data for this. Yeah. So while this is kind of seen as like, oh yeah, this is actually this is like a system where there is no labor associated and there's nothing taking place here, it turns out that no, there was a significant amount of this. And when we did see this, one thing we found was that one thing that where this didn't actually one of the reasons it got retired was that after employing thousands of people for thousands of hours to be tracking all these videos, they weren't able to come up with the necessary information or the necessary data sets to automate this and then dispose of all these other all the people who are working remotely like this. This has been one thing that's come up, and like this really highlights that in many cases, I've like you the question is like it's when you think about AI, is it artificial intelligence or is it absent intelligence? Is there someone who's not there who's actually inside this? And I think this you see this come up quite a few times. And like that's one very high profile example of this, but there are plenty other ones because this is one of the kind of dirty secrets that you often have associated where you see when people talk about these tooling is that there's a huge amount of labor and it's often people who are often in marginalized positions who don't have very strong negotiating power to actually start labeling things or stuff like that. This is one thing that comes up again and again and again. And this, I think, is really worth bearing in mind because it's not just the energy infrastructure or the computer infrastructure. There's a whole part about labor that we need to be thinking about as well here.
I'm glad you mentioned the Amazon thing because I feel like that had its news cycle, but like I feel like it needs to be talked about more because it's kind of egregious that Amazon it would not mention the fact that like there was also human labor involved in that. 'Cause they sold it as like, oh yeah, cameras and just automatically detecting faces, and that was a part of it. But the other part were like people in a remote place, actually identifying who was taking the sandwich off the shelf.
Mhm.
And I feel like throughout history, there's a through line of people who have less, not doing jobs for not that much money to make the lives of people who have more much more convenient. And it feels
Mhm.
like with tech, there's an added, disappointingly, there's an added aspect of it of trying to obscure away the that part of it, just trying to, like dust it under the rug or hide it behind the curtain or whatever metaphor you want to use. And that to me is like really disappointing.
Mm.
It's definitely, very much giving like pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. Like it's a straight up, Wizard of Oz, Wiz reference. And the reality of it is big tech benefits from making us think that AI is magic,
Yeah.
that it just happens. That there's
Yeah.
because when you just think of it as magic, you don't think about the bias that informs it. You don't think about the people that it hurts. You probably are only thinking about the future and what it could do and not what it's already doing right now, which of course are the things that we lift up in the AI intersections database. Like there is no magic here. There is no intelligence here, to Chris's point, like artificial or not, it is a predictive technology that is literally just trained on what it thinks people will do. But the people who it's modeling after are folks who introduce their bias in the system. So it's much easier to sell it as something that you have to have if you talk about it as magic, as opposed to talking about the data workers in Kenya who are quite literally being traumatized and having to get mental health support because they're being asked to label things like child sexual abuse material and things like that because they
Mm.
want their systems to be able to filter these things out. But they don't do that if they are not trained, and they cannot be trained without people, period.
Yeah, that's such a good point. I think the next question I want to ask is like, how do we make sure this ends up working for us? Like, what can we do to make sure, big tech companies are eager to kind of, you know, pay no attention to the man behind the curtain is a great way to put it. Like, pay no attention to the cheap labor we're using, pay no attention to the carbon footprint. What you're using is magic. How do we make sure that the people are benefiting from this in a way that's fair and transparent and like works for us and not just works for Apple, Google, and Microsoft?
So I could maybe touch on some of this actually, Xavier. I
Mhm.
think one of the key things is that for quite some time, generally people who've been considered as technology workers have been considered maybe say high up the kind of income scale and high up the kind of, I guess, the privilege gradient. You've got control over where and how you work and everything like that. And what we've seen over the last like few years is that those this kind of very very kind of strong position that a lot of technology workers found themselves in. It turns out that they weren't in such a strong position as they initially they thought they were. We've seen multiple rounds of layoffs, which have really kind of had a number of effects inside large firms like this, to basically make it hard to kind of like in many ways make it harder for it to make people less likely to kind of assert some of their rights that they might actually have. And if we look outside of the technology industry, we've seen that there are common ways that people who are working in organizations have been able to kind of resist some of some of the kind of more egregious abuses of power. If you look inside, and actually, I mean, Amazon is probably one of the good examples. You see, like Amazon was, we've seen the unionization of warehouse workers in lots of places, as a way to actually start gaining better conditions to be working in. And we've seen that this is something that we've seen technology workers in many cases be less of a hurry to do this, I suppose, or be somewhat reticent about organizing like this. Now, there are books that do make this clear and really kind of spell a bunch of this stuff out. But it's also worth bearing in mind that if you think about some of the things that we take for granted, like say 8-hour days or kind of, well, 8-hour days or weekends, these weren't necessarily a thing that was delivered by kind of industrial revolutions or AI. These were delivered by people being a negotiation, like a collective negotiation and things like this. This is one thing that I think that we don't have that much of right now, and this is something that you do need to see. And there are actually lessons we've seen from, like, say, the United Auto Workers Association in America doing this, when you have seen people talking about, oh, let's move to EVs, let's make sure that we have some control over, or make sure that people are not that fewer people are left behind, or in some sectors where there is quite strong union representation, people have been able to kind of get concessions or get protections. And like the good example might be the Screen Actors Guild. Sorry, not the Screen Actors Guild, the script writers who've been able to get concessions away from some of the writing, some of the things they might be doing being automated away essentially. So I think there's stuff like that that can be done, but isn't really done that much in the technology sector.
That's such a good point. I feel like I feel like you're right. Like we were talking before about this idea that once AI arrives, we're gonna have more time for art. Everything's gonna be great. We'll just have more time to just, kick it with our kids and like, but like you're right. You don't get that stuff unless you like fight for it. Like the weekends don't come just because new technology is here. It's people who have to like say like, no, give me my time back. And I feel like that's important to remember. We're seeing a lot of great comments on social media and on the LinkedIn live comments. And thank you so much for everyone watching. And thank you so much for everyone chiming in. I want to surface this one comment. It says, also, building accessibility is one thing, but maintaining is another. And I want to
Mhm.
ask a question about how do we go about not just adding disability justice into the things that we create, but how do we maintain it? How do we keep that plant watered? How do we like make sure it continues to like be good?
Mm. Well, isn't that the question? I mean, I think, I think, what's interesting is, I mean, in the history of the US, we never had that, right? Like all we've ever had is we pass law. I mean, the history of disability rights, I should say, rather than justice in America, has been that we pass laws, and those laws have been for the richest disabled folks in the country, and they've been about law, not access. And most folks haven't had access to the disability rights that we have because they've been primarily enforceable only by legal action. And so, and that's the ADA, and that's a lot of the access in America has been accessible only to the most privileged disabled folks in our country. And some access has been accessible to a lot of folks. And so I think, as we go through yet another massive transition in this moment, and I think AI is a big technology transition, we have a moment to say yet again, what if we do it better this time? Right? Let's
Right.
demand better than previous moments. Let's try to take this moment. And if we are doing a big organizing push, let's keep in mind all these principles. And when I say disability justice, I mean as defined by SIN's Invalid. And I really encourage folks to go to the SIN's Invalid site and look at their 10 principles of disability justice. And that's how I ground my thinking of disability justice, and say, okay, when we talk about accessibility, we don't just mean law, we mean access. We mean, can people actually get this? Can people actually use this technology? Right now, most of these platforms, if you don't have money, it's 3 questions a day. You can use it 3 times a day. You have to have a lot of access to resources to be able to use most of these AI platforms and most of these AI technologies. What does it mean to have, what does it mean to have AI for the people, as one organization calls themselves, one incredible AI organization, focus specifically on AI for Black folks calls themselves AI for the people. What does it mean to have this to be accessible for a lot of folks? So that's what I'm very interested in. I'm very interested in, if we are going to have these technologies, if we're going to make them accessible, what does it mean to make this for a lot of folks? What does it mean for this not just to be accessible by law, but by reality? And I think that we should be thinking about that. And obviously we need to legislate it, but I think we need to legislate it and go beyond that. And that takes more than just what the law says. It takes what we create with one another, and what we do in our communities together. And that's something that Mia Birdsong teaches all of us. It's like, you know, freedom is something that we create together in our communities. So I hope we can do both. I think that, like what Chris says about unionizing is important. I think we need to organize a large progressive coalition with a lot of different groups and a social justice coalition. I think we need government legislation. You know, I think all of these things kind of have to happen simultaneously. And then I think as communities, we have to come together and also, you know, do this work together. Creating freedom and imagining freedom, and that includes with technology.
That's such an important point. And I think it kind of leads into my last question. My final question can be for each person on the panel. Maya, you kind of already answered it, but you can talk about it, speak on it again if you want to. Basically, how do we do it better this time? Kind of the quote you just said, like, how do we do it better this time? What maybe we can start with Chris and go to Kenria, and Maya if we want, but how do we do it better this time or next time?
I think part of this might be about being really explicit about what the goals are for any kind of technology, for example. And I'm channeling Rachel Caldicott, who has this wonderful t-shirt, and on the quote, she says, like, let's make AI for 8 billion people, not 8 billionaires. And I think this is actually a really nice way to kind of frame it, right? Because, like, what is this for here? And I think this really does actually it kind of really reframes, like, okay, we've got something, a very, very promising, powerful piece technology. Let's have a really clear discussion about who gets to reap most of the rewards of this, and how we actually distribute the fruits of this, as it were, or something like that. This is something that I think that right now we're not really being that explicit about, and I think there's something we should be able to do, especially when you bear in mind that there's huge amounts of time and money being allocated to support these industries and the rollout of this. Like we spoke about, say, the rollout of an energy, for example, and the energy that's being used. We have the Inflation Reduction Act in America, where around half of the actual cost of all the rollout for green energy is being paid for by the state here. So there's discussion. What kind of strings do you want to have associated with this, so that you can actually say, well, okay, yes, you're going to have some of the profits and some of the benefits, but we should be have an open conversation about how that's shared and how the actual benefits are shared more widely than just going to the people who are owning the companies here.
Such a good point. Yeah, you're right. I think as far as it's being sold to me, it's like AI is going to help. It's going to help me write emails and help me write my wedding vows, and like, cool. But like, it seems like the upside is mostly for these companies. And I love that quote of 8 billion people, not 8 billionaires. Let's make sure it works for 8 billion people. Kenria, what is your final takeaways? Like, what do you want to leave people with? How do we do it better this time?
Well, I think that we, first of all, start from the starting place of knowing that nothing happens in a vacuum, which means that we have to work together, right? AI is not only, impacting disabled people over here and people of color over there, and, folks who are economically disadvantaged over there. It's doing it all at the same time. And so, I think looking to the past, as we've talked a little bit about, really gives us an example of what we can be doing now and what we should be doing moving forward. And so if we come from the place of, nothing happens in a vacuum, we have to solve these problems systemically and together, the only conclusion is that we collaborate in order to reach our collective aims. So we can't do this with just one part of the movement. Mozilla, we call our movement that we are in the internet health movement, but the internet health movement doesn't move without the racial justice movement, the DJ movement, the environmental justice movement.
Yes,
we have to work together. We have to find the places where our collective aims come together so that we can, work towards solutions together. And that looks like, advocacy campaigns like we run here at Mozilla. That looks like funding research research, that gives honest assessments of what's happening in big tech, not just their internal findings of what they want to tell us, giving us an actual look into the black box of what they're doing and what they're doing with our data. It looks like us pushing back when these companies introduce AI systems that ask too much and do too little. For example, the recall, that was a system that was introduced by Microsoft a few weeks ago.
Yeah.
As of Friday, it is dead. And that is completely due to folks criticizing them when they first announced it and saying, hey, no, I don't want this. I don't
Right.
care if it's supposed to run locally. It puts my data at risk, and they were trying to make folks opt out instead of opting in. So the first step was that they changed that because of advocacy. And then they went ahead and killed it completely. This is how we win. We collaborate, we organize, we do it together.
Yeah, and Recall is the app that it's not even an app, it's just like a Microsoft service where it constantly screenshots what the computer's
You're
seeing
all
and
of
then
it.
yeah, all of
Exactly.
it. And it uses AI to like give you stuff you need, but also it's like, do you want to have like your entirety screenshotted constantly?
No,
I
no, I do
guess,
not.
yeah, I personally did not either, but at the very least, you should like A, have the choice and B, not have it not be opted into it by default. I don't know if you've seen me like nodding my head furiously this whole time. You both have so much like great things to say. I'm excited to hear what Meyer says because like I agree with a lot of this. Okay, so final takeaway, Meyer. How do we do it better this time?
Oh my goodness. I mean, obviously organize. We have to
Yeah.
organize. And I think we have to have some goals in mind. I really believe that like we need to have a North Star vision of what AI looks like. Organizationally, individually, collectively, all of us. And I think we have to have some wins in mind. I think every other big moment in technology history, we've had wins in mind. And I think we have to have some defense in mind. We need to be countering surveillance. We need to be countering this hypercharged depression. Um, and I think that we need to have some dreams in mind, though, of what we should be able to get out of this, like a 32-hour work week in the US. I think we should be having something beautiful to imagine in this moment that would be good for us, too, that isn't just AI taking our art and our music so that we have more time for laundry. Because that would be a really sad outcome if that
But a
was
lot of
what we
clean
got.
clothes, but a lot of clean clothes,
But a lot of clean
but a
clothes.
lot of clean clothes. Well, I appreciate you all joining me today. Where can folks find more of your work? We'll start with Chris and then go down the line.
Yeah.
Climaction.tech is a website and a online community of around 10,000 technology workers who are working on climate. That's one of the best places to go to. My day job is the Green Web Foundation, which is Green Web Foundation. But those are the two places I would suggest you look at first.
Cool. Meyer?
Yes. You can find the Disability Culture Lab at disabilityculturelab.org, disability_lab on Twitter. And we're also Disability Culture Lab across Instagram, LinkedIn, and Facebook. So come look us up. Come join us in one of our many online communities. We'd love to see you. We just launched a couple weeks ago. So
Cool. And
hang
finally,
out.
Kenria.
Well, you can find the AI intersections database at aidatabase.mozilla.org. And I am at Kenria on all of the things.
Awesome. And I'm Xavier on Instagram and Twitter, but not TikTok, unfortunately. That's too bad for me. But yeah, follow more of what we do at foundation.mozilla.org. You can follow us at Mozilla on Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, LinkedIn, where you're watching this likely right now. And yeah, thank you everyone for joining me today. And thank you to our panelists for joining me today. I'm really glad we could have this conversation.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you. See you, everybody.
Thank you.